mode.
Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Diane Baden, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. We are pleased to present this webinar in our series on RDA, Resource Description and Access. Our presenter today is Kathy Glennan, Head of Special Resources Cataloging at the University of Maryland. Kathy has more than 25 years' experience cataloging scores and sound recordings. She currently chairs the Music Library Association's Bibliographic Control Committee and has been active in ALA's Committee on Cataloging, Description, and Access, where she worked on development of RDA instructions in relation to music materials. At any time during the webinar, if you have questions for Kathy, please type them into the question box on your screen. Kathy will leave time at the end to respond to as many questions as possible. Please note that we are recording the presentation, and you will receive an email shortly after the conclusion of the webinar with a copy of the slides and a link to the recording. And now I will turn the program over to Kathy. There will be a slight pause as we change presenters.
Thank you, Diane. I welcome all of you to this webinar. Because of the time limitations we have today, I will be presenting the changes in the context of 3 examples. For those of you who attended my webinar last week, RDA Basics Scores, there will be a bit of content overlap, although I have tried to keep that to a minimum. At the end of the presentation, I will provide links to other presentations that have taken a more systematic approach in identifying the major changes between RDA and AACR2 when it comes to cataloging music. As Diane mentioned, we will have time at the end of my presentation to take your questions. The examples we're going to look at today incorporate instructions from RDA, interpretations from the Library of Congress policy statements, known as the LCPS, and my own cataloger's judgment. The LCPS have been developed for LC's own use, but they are fully incorporated into the RDA toolkit and are available for all users to consult. As we approach full RDA implementation in the United States, additional guidance should be available from other organizations. The Program for Cooperative Cataloging is working on developing policies and training materials for RDA, and the Music Library Association has begun work on best practice documentation that will supplement other guidelines with an eye toward addressing situations particular to music materials. In the following examples, I decided to follow RDA Appendix A for capitalization. These instructions essentially match the current AACR2 practices. Most of the authorized access points in the examples follow the current AACR2 form found in the name authority file. I have updated a few of these to their RDA equivalents, which I will identify in the full examples. And now on to the first example. I picked this just for the illustration. It's a compact disc which contains a collection of songs performed by the group Freakwater. Here are the images of the container and the disc label. As I prepare to create an RDA record for this, the first thing to consider is the preferred source of information. RDA groups resources into 3 broad categories when laying out the instructions for preferred sources: resources with pages, leaves, sheets, or cards, resources that consist of moving images, and everything else. Sound recordings obviously fall into the final category. The preferred source of information is either the label, as long as it contains a permanently printed or affixed title, or embedded metadata that contains a title, such as metadata embedded in an MP3 file. If neither of these sources exist, or if neither provides a title, only then can you use another source within the resource itself. For sound recordings, this would include the container and any program notes. This is a change from AACR2, but it does not affect this particular example. The title is transcribed as it appears on the source of information. This disc has a collective title on the label, so I will use that. Even though I am taking the title from a preferred source, RDA contains instructions about both in 2.3.2.2 and 2.20.2.3, and those apply when the title does not come from a title page or title frame. While this note is not a core element in RDA proper, it is core per the LCPS. Making such a note is a change from AACR2. In another significant change from AACR2, the general material designation is never part of an RDA record. Instead, RDA records have separate elements for content, media, and carrier type. I will get to those in a few minutes. To determine if this compilation will be identified by Freakwater and the title, or just by the title, I must decide if the group is simply a performing body. This decision will also impact whether or not I record a statement of responsibility. If the role of the group goes beyond that of mere performance, it will be considered the creator per RDA 19.2.1.1. This would mean putting Freakwater in a 110 field as the creator and recording the group's name in the statement of responsibility. If instead the group's participation is confined to performance, execution, or interpretation, I will record the information about Freakwater in a 511 field. Although it's tempting to select Freakwater as the creator, especially since Irwin and Bean are both members of the group and have collectively written 7 of the 12 songs, I have decided that this is a compilation of works by different people, all performed by a single group. Therefore, my MARC record will not have a 1XX field or a 245 subfield C. Next, we'll look at the publication statement. RDA 2.8.1.4 sets forward the transcription guidelines for publication statements. Notice that unlike with AACR2, you will not give the name of a publisher or distributor in the shortest form in which it can be understood and identified internationally. The sources for information for the publication statement come from the same source as the title proper, another source within the resource, including the container and the program notes, and any other source. For sound recordings, then, the sources within the resource are the label, the container, and the accompanying material. If you do need to supply information from outside the resource, you will need to enclose it in square brackets. The place of publication is transcribed from the resource, if the information is available. If more than one place of publication appears, only the first one is a core element in RDA. If no place of publication is stated anywhere in the resource, you may supply a known or probable place of publication, or you may record place of publication not identified, and that's placed in square brackets per the RDA instruction. For this resource, the back of the container clearly states that it was published in Chicago, Illinois, and it uses the postal abbreviation for the state. RDA lacks AACR2's specific guidance about how to treat trade names or brand names associated with sound recording publishers. In this example, the disc label has both Thrill Jockey and Thrill Jockey Records displaying. Unfortunately, the LCPS also do not contain any guidance about choosing between these two options that both appear on my preferred source. Thus, this is a matter of cataloger's judgment. Per RDA 2.8.1.1, the publisher's name is the name of a person, family, or corporate body responsible for publishing, releasing, or issuing a resource. I believe the record label, Thrill Jockey, meets this requirement. In addition, the label name is likely how our end users will identify a sound recording publisher. This choice also carries forward the AACR2 practice, which will lend consistency in bibliographic records in the local catalog. However, this is certainly an area to look for best practice guidelines in the future. RDA has separate elements for publication date and copyright date. In AACR2, the phonogram copyright date, or P date, often substituted for the publication date. This is not the case in RDA. Phonogram dates represent the copyright of the recorded sound. A standard copyright date, which may also appear on sound recordings, represents the copyright of everything else, such as the program notes or the artwork. In this case, my phonogram and copyright dates are identical, so I've used 1993 as my estimated date of publication. Here is my completed 260 field. Because the phonogram date has been an essential descriptive element in AACR2 records, I strongly recommend including this optional element in RDA records as well. If you have multiple copyright dates associated with various aspects of the sound recording, RDA 2.11 says to record only the latest copyright date. This instruction does not make a distinction between phonogram and copyright dates. However, I would only record the phonogram date for sound recordings. I would use the copyright date as needed to infer a publication date following the current AACR2 practice. RDA's extent statement has changed significantly from AACR2. For example, some of the terminology has changed. AACR2's special material designation of sound disc becomes audio disc in RDA. Although audio disc is the standard term for compact discs in RDA, Instruction 3.4.1.5c allows the use of an alternative term if preferred by the agency preparing the description. Local policies or best practice guidelines may specify which term to use for compact discs. Unlike AACR2, RDA provides a clear and consistent place to record the encoding format. Although this is not a core element, I have decided to use CD audio, so my record contains eye-readable content, identifying this as a compact disc. I consider this an important element because RDA does not provide for the inclusion of the compact disc note that we have used in AACR2. Other ways to bring out the format of the recording would be to use either of the terms in common usage on the previous slide, one CD or one compact disc, to rely on the dimensions recorded in field 300 subfield C, or to rely on various 007 codes in the MARC record. Additional elements are also available, which can be encoded in field 300 subfield B. This includes playing speed, groove characteristics, track configuration, tape configuration, configuration of playback channels, and special playback characteristics as applicable. Most of these instructions are in RDA 3.16. Again, these are not core elements. For the examples in this webinar, I have included the configuration of playback channels only if they are stated in the resource. I have omitted all of these others as they are standard for all compact discs. Unlike in AACR2, stereo and mono are not considered abbreviations in RDA. Instead, they are words in their own right. Therefore, they are not followed by a period, nor are they spelled out as stereophonic or monophonic. You will see this usage when we get to the second example. RDA's instructions and examples use the metric system as units of measurement. However, RDA 0.11.5 includes an option to record dimensions in the system of measure preferred by the agency creating the data. Using cataloger's judgment and consulting the LCPS for 3.5.1.3, I have decided to use inches in these examples. Units of measurements are one of the few elements where RDA allows for abbreviations. So based on Appendix B.7, I will use IN period for inches. If you decide to use metric dimensions for compact discs, you will record 12 centimeters instead. Here is my complete 300 field. As I mentioned earlier, the new MARC 33X fields for content, media, and carrier type are used instead of AACR2's general material designation for all materials. These instructions for these three elements come from different places in RDA, 6.9, 3.2, and 3.3 respectively. For musical sound recordings, the values you see on this slide will be the normal ones. If you had a cassette instead of a disc, the 338 subfield A would be audio cassette. For non-musical recordings, the 336 subfield A would be either spoken word or sounds. Although the 338 and 300 subfield A content is nearly identical, these are two distinct elements and serve separate functions within RDA. The systems will be able to use each element in different ways. Moving on, here are the first four notes I have for this example. The first note is tagged with a new MARC 380 field for form of work. The equivalent note in an AACR2 record would appear in a 500 field. I've already mentioned why I've included the source of title note. Due to the nature of the performing group, I decided to list both the corporate body name and the members and their roles when I recorded the 511 field. In RDA, place and date of capture are separate elements. The instructions are in 7.11.2 and 7.11.3 in RDA respectively. The MARC formats have been updated to include separate coding for these in the 518 field. Thus, this particular field looks a bit different from its AACR2 equivalent. The subfield O information that starts the 518 field is not actually part of RDA. However, until our systems can generate appropriate display labels for this data, the introductory term provides end users with the appropriate context for this information. My final note field is the contents note. It's not obvious where to find instructions about contents notes in RDA because they're really not considered a type of note. Instead, you should think of them as a structured description of the related works. They convey a whole-part relationship. This means that the instructions and examples for contents notes are in Chapter 25. For MARC 21 purposes, the contents note is still in field 505. While RDA examples in Chapter 25 use the display text contains, you may still encode the 505 first indicator as 0 to generate a display constant of contents in a MARC record. The differences between these terms are not substantial, and in the future, the text generated from the MARC display constant could change to match the RDA examples. Here's the contents note for this CD. There are actually no differences in this example from what I would have done under AACR2. Here is my almost complete record for this compact disc, minus the MARC fixed fields and the relevant subject headings. You have seen most of these fields already in the previous slides. As with AACR2 MARC records, I am assuming that appropriate displays for end users can be generated for the UPC and publisher number from the O2X fields. You may notice the relator term used in the 710 field, We will get to that in a few minutes. Let's move on to my next example. Here are the images of the container and the disk label for this example. As you can probably see, the disk label does not have a collective title, although there is one on the container. I mentioned earlier that with RDA, the title must come from the disk label if it has a title that identifies the resource as a whole. I believe that the title of Italian Songs and the list of the 4 composers on the label meet this criterion, so the disk label will be the source of my title. This represents a significant change from AACR2, where I would actively seek a collective title from elsewhere in the resource to put in the 245 field before settling on using the disk label in a case like this. Of course, RDA recognizes that the container title is still an important variant, so I can provide access to the impatient lover elsewhere in my record. Here is what I've come up with from my title and container title fields. With the 246 field, I had to decide if Italian Songs, as seen on the container, is other title information or a noun phrase occurring with a statement of responsibility. The decision determines whether or not Italian Songs appears in the 246 field at all. Other title information associated with a variant title may be recorded in a 246 subfield B. However, per RDA 2.4.1.8, a noun phrase occurring with a statement of responsibility is actually part of that statement of responsibility. As such, Italian Songs would not be recorded in the 245 field, since that field is used exclusively for title information. Considering such noun phrases as part of the statement of responsibility is a change from AACR2. Because Italian Songs matches my title proper and is associated with the collective title on the container, I have opted for recording this in the 246 subfield B as other title information. Just as with the first example, this resource is a compilation of works by various composers. This fact impacts several elements in an RDA MARC record. First, the compilation will always be named by its title, regardless of whether the resource has a collective title. This is a change from AACR2, where the principal performer was the main entry for a sound recording with a collective title. There are several possibilities for listing all of the compositions contained in the resource. In the 245 field, if there is no collective title, in a contents note, if the resource has a collective title, and authorized access points for each composition. In a significant change from AACR2, RDA permits using this last option of authorized access points by itself, without having those access points justified in the descriptive portion of the record. Best practice guidelines could address whether or not this is advisable. Listing all of the compositions goes beyond the RDA core elements. Per instruction 17.10, RDA requires an authorized access point only for the predominant or first named expression in a compilation. However, the LCPS for 25.1 makes recording-related works a core element for compilations. In addition, RDA 6.27.1.4 states, if the compilation lacks a collective title, construct separate access points for each of the works in the compilation. While this instruction is not identified as a core element, an authorized access point for each performance will help our end users find, identify, select, and obtain resources to meet their needs. Although creating authorized access points for each expression is the primary instruction, RDA contains an alternative instruction in 6.28.2.3 that allows for adding the term selections to the authorized access point for a musical work if you have 2 or more unnumbered or non-consecutively numbered parts of a musical work. Finally, according to RDA 20.2, performers contribute to the realization of a work through an expression. As such, they will be recorded in 7XX fields in the MARC record. In this compilation, although everything is sung in Italian, 3 of the 18 works originally had German words. Thus, for the authorized access point for the performances of those 3 works, the language of the expression needs to be added to the access point per RDA 6.11. RDA 6.27.3 gives instructions for adding elements to the authorized access point for the work to identify expressions. Additional elements are then added to differentiate one expression from another. One of these elements indicates the content type using the table in RDA 6.9. For musical sound recordings, the appropriate term is performed music. Utilizing such terms consistently would disambiguate access points for a score and a sound recording of the same composition, which would otherwise have identical character strings in a local catalog. I have included this element in the complete example. Emphasizes the importance of conveying relationships, including that of the person to the resource. Appendix I contains lists of relator terms that can be appended to authorized access points to specify these relationships, such as compiler, arranger of music, translator, and printer. Because RDA uses terms, they are recorded in subfield E in a 700 field instead of the equivalent or near equivalent subfield 4 relator codes. Here is my almost complete record for the second example, again without the MARC fixed fields and the subject headings. Due to the length of this record, I have broken it into 3 separate screenshots. There are definitely some differences from what an AACR2 record would look like for the same resource. As a quick refresher, these include there's no 1XX field, there's no GMD, there's different terminology in the 300 field. There is a source of title note, but there is no compact disc note, and the 518 field is formatted and has additional content designation. In this part of the record, you will see that I have used relator terms in the 700 subfield E instead of the subfield 4 codes. So I've used subfield E vocalist instead of subfield 4 VOC, and subfield E instrumentalist instead of subfield 4 ITR. In this case, I've taken these terms from RDA Appendix I. You may use the MARC code list for relators instead of these RDA terms, and those are available as part of the MARC documentation. And last but not least, I have added the subfield H performed music to the authorized access point for each of the compositions in the resource. In this example, you can see that I provided individual access to each selection from Beethoven's Opus 82. I'll discuss an alternative approach to this in the next example. Note that one of my access points has been changed to its RDA form. Here, arranged is spelled out rather than abbreviated. However, nothing else in that access point was changed. The next example is a 2-CD set, which is housed along with the program notes in a single container. This compilation of works by a single composer does not have a collective title, and there are some title variations between the disc labels and the container. Because I will be creating a comprehensive description for a resource issued in more than one part, I will need to find a source of information that identifies the resource as a whole. RDA 2.1.2.3 permits using sources for the individual parts as a collective source of information for the whole, as long as there is no other source that identifies the resource as a whole. Thus, I will use the label information from both CDs as my preferred source of information. Because I have taken the title from the labels and not the container, I have listed the two groupings of the symphonies as they appear on the discs. The container had symphonies 1 to 4 listed together. While this is yet another example of a sound recording compilation, this time it only contains works by one composer. This means that I will need to determine the preferred title for this resource, and that will be some form of collective title. Per RDA 6.14.2.8, when the compilation consists of works by a single composer, the collective title will be as precise as possible to represent the nature of the collection, including works of various types for one broad medium of performance, such as keyboard music, works of various types for one specific medium of performance, such as piano music, works of one type for one specific medium or various media, such as quartets. If you have the complete works, you would use works. In any of these categories, if the collection is not complete, RDA has an alternative instruction to add the term selections to the term selected as the preferred title. This includes creating the preferred title of works, period, selections, rather than the AACR2 equivalent of using selections by itself. This is the instruction that would have allowed me to reduce the number of access points for Beethoven's Opus 82 in the previous example. Instead of providing individual authorized access points for each of the 4 parts of that work contained on the recording, I could have simply provided the authorized access point for Opus 82 and appended subfield K, selections. Other than the distinction in identifying the preferred title, the same RDA instructions apply for compilations of works by a single composer as with compilations of works by more than one composer. The same needs exist for identifying the works contained in the resource and for providing authorized access points for the performers. Identifiers for the manifestation include ISBNs, UPCs, and other internationally recognized schemes, as well as sound recording issue or publisher numbers. Each of these identifiers is a character string that differentiates one manifestation from another. While there are separate instructions in RDA 2.15 for notated music, sound recording numbers fall under the general instruction. Because these are not standardized numbers, they do not have a prescribed display. Therefore, they are transcribed as they appear on the resource. As with AACR2, the display of the number will be preceded by the trade or label name. The identifier for the manifestation is a core element, with RDA preferring an internationally recognized identifier if applicable. However, I certainly could go beyond the core element here, since the numbers assigned to a sound recording by a publisher have great significance in identifying the resource. Per RDA 2.15.1.5, if the resource has multiple identifiers of the same type, record the one for the resource as a whole if it appears on all of the parts. Optionally, also record the identifiers associated with those individual parts. Unfortunately, RDA provides no clear instruction about what to do in this case, where the number for the set only appears on the container, with separate numbers appearing on each disk. So, this is another opportunity for me to use cataloger's judgment. I will extend the concept behind that optional additional instruction and will record each of these numbers. I have not put qualifiers for the container or disk in the 028 subfield A, following the current practice in MARC 21. Because those qualifiers are needed per RDA, I have created separate iReadable equivalents in the 500 fields that include this additional information. Instructions about the duration statement come from RDA 7.22, and there are specific instructions that address recording the duration of the individual components in a resource. However, all of these instructions say to record the duration as stated on the resource. They make no mention of using a label or introductory phrase. Because MARC does not have the capability of having the system automatically supply duration as part of the display of a 500 field, this type of note will still need to start with that term to provide end users with the appropriate context. Because you record the durations as stated, you may end up with either the colon formatting that I have in this example, or with the numbers and abbreviations for hours, minutes, and seconds. Those abbreviations are permitted because duration is a form of measurement. RDA does not address how to record durations for works with multiple movements, and the LCRI that addressed this situation in AACR2 6.7b10 has not carried over to the LCPS, so I have to use my own cataloger's judgment here. Adding up the movement totals underestimates the total timing due to pauses between the movements, while following the old LCRI and rounding up to the nearest minute overstates the durations. In this situation, I have opted for the latter, but this is another area where best practice guidelines would be helpful. Here is my near complete example, again omitting the MARC fixed fields and the subject headings. I have not provided a relator term in the 100 field, since I consider that the 100 plus 240 fields name the work and already convey the appropriate relationship. Please note that this is my own cataloger's judgment at this point, and others disagree with me. However, for all of our sakes, I anticipate that there will be definitive guidance coming from the Program for Cooperative Cataloging on this issue. Their work is scheduled to be completed prior to RDA implementation. I have, however, added those relator terms to the performers in the 700 fields. The result may look a bit odd here, since these access points contain two terms that convey similar information. However, these terms are serving two different purposes. Subfield C is used to differentiate the name from others like it, while the subfield E is used to denote the relationship. I have changed these two headings to their RDA equivalents. The major difference is capitalizing the subfield C qualifier and enclosing it in parentheses. You'll see that there is one more RDA authorized access point in this record. The only difference there is spelling out the word arranged. Notice that I have not provided individual authorized access points for each of the symphonies. Per RDA 6.14.2.8.5, if a compilation consists of a consecutively numbered group, the inclusive numbering is recorded following the name of the type of composition. The MARC formats were recently updated to allow for greater granularity in coding so that MARC elements would better match their RDA equivalents. Some of these changes were specific to corporate bodies. New subfields in the 046 field allow for separate coding of the start and end period of an entity. The 368 field can contain a term to differentiate this body from others with similar names. This includes a designation if the name does not convey the idea of a corporate body. This field was approved by MARBI in July 2011, so it is not yet available for use. I anticipate that OCLC will implement this sometime next year. The 370 field may contain a significant location associated with a corporate body. With the 371 field, you may encode the address of the corporate body's headquarters or offices, or an email or internet address for the body. The 372 field may contain a term that identifies a field of business in which the corporate body is engaged, its area of competence, responsibility, jurisdiction, etc. So going back to my first example, the existing authority record for Freakwater could be updated to include the following new elements: an 046 subfield S for when it was founded, a 368 with the term musical group, which is also used in the authorized heading. Remember, this field is not yet available. And a 372 field with a more specific identification of the nature of the performing group. The advantage of consistently encoding and indexing this information in authority records includes being able to retrieve a list of musical groups formed in a particular decade that are represented by authority records. Similar encoding enhancements were made for MARC fields associated with works and expressions. The 377 field is used for the language in which a work is expressed. As such, it only belongs in expression records and not work records. You've seen that I used field 380 in a few of the examples. It is valid in both the authority and bibliographic formats. The 381 field is used for a characteristic that is not accommodated in any other field that serves to characterize a work or expression. And finally, the 382 through 384 fields are exclusive to musical works. Looking at how these new fields could be applied to one of the works on the Impatient Lover disc, the following new elements could be added to the existing record. The 380 gives the form of the work. Field 382 records the medium of performance, using the terms from RDA Chapter 6, which govern the creation of authorized access points. The 383 field contains the thematic index numbers for this work. Subfield C is specific to thematic index numbers. Other subfields are available for serial and opus numbers as applicable. Subfield D identifies the source of that thematic index number. That particular term is taken from the list recently created by the Music Library Association, Thematic Indexes used in the Library of Congress /NACO authority file. Subfield 2 identifies that list with the MLATI code. This particular resource is linked from the MARC documentation online. Recording this type of information in the authority record allows for clearly identifying information that is always associated with the work. This should save the time of the cataloger in not having to consult reference sources each time, and should allow for retrieval of information based on these characteristics in a similar fashion to what could happen with corporate names. For example, when this data is fully encoded and indexed, I should be able to identify all cantatas for a soprano soloist that are represented by authority records. If you would like to see the presentations available from the February 2011 RDA pre-conference given at the annual meeting of the Music Library Association, visit the first link on this slide and then look under the heading RDA documentation on that page to find all of the relevant links. These include some full examples. I also recommend the second presentation, prepared by Danielle Paradis for the International Association of Music Libraries, Archives, and Documentation Centers Congress in 2010. And now we have time for your questions. And if I don't get to everything or something comes up afterward, feel free to email me.
Thank you, Kathy. This is Diane again. I'm going to moderate the question period, and quite a few of you have already sent questions in. So I would like to just say that if we do not get to all of your questions, we will provide a transcript of them to Kathy, and she will provide written answers that will go out to all of the attendees at a later time. So let's get started. The examples you use involve original RDA cataloging. Do you have any advice for updating AACR2 records with RDA elements? Are there any differences in application of RDA rules in hybrid situations?
This is an interesting question, and it's something that I think all of us are struggling with. I'm looking toward the Program for Cooperative Cataloging to provide some guidance. I know that OCLC is looking at being able to automate some of these changes. They are potentially looking at populating the 33X fields into all bibliographic records, even though these fields were established for RDA but are valid in all formats. I would look specifically toward OCLC and PCC guidance about hybrid records.
Thank you. You say the term compact disc is not an RDA, but I've found OCLC records with 500 compact disc and also CD audio in the 300 field, subfield B. That's a hybrid record.
Yeah. RDA doesn't provide for the compact disc note, and I specifically was looking for notes about format. I really believe that the RDA expects this information to be recorded effectively, in MARC speak, in the 300 field and not anywhere else. But it could be a hybrid record. It could also be old habits die very hard. I've also seen RDA discs that use one sound disc instead of one audio disc in the 300 field.
This is a related question. Does digital go in the 300 field, subfield B? I've seen OCLC records with subfield B, digital, CD, audio.
Digital would be optional. I chose not to include it in my examples because it is a default for compact discs, and I felt that I had adequately identified my compact disc in the 300 field without adding that. But this is an area where I think best practices could help us standardize what's important and get some consistency in our records.
What was the rule again for the Nielsen set with no collective title that let you use both disc labels?
Okay, I have to get back to my notes. Hold on a minute. I have to figure out where that was. RDA 2.1.2.3 permits using sources for the individual parts as a collective source of information for the whole, as long as there is no other source that identifies the resource as a whole. So I hope that answered that question.
Is there a reason you used subfield E singer for the third example, but subfield E vocalist for Bartoli in the second example?
Oh, this is what I get for giving examples to catalogers. No, it was probably what I was working from in the first place. All of these records had OCLC copied to begin with, and I probably just took the lead from what I was looking at. So I would need to go back and look at Appendix I and see which one is more appropriate. I'm sorry, I can't give you a better answer than that.
You should know that 2 of the attendees noticed that and asked that question.
Yeah, well, that's always a problem.
In example 3, should the 240 also end with a subfield H performed music as the 7XX fields do?
That is a very good question, and it's one that I had not considered. Possibly. But this performed music stuff is kind of new to me, as it is to most of us. So I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for that as well, but it certainly would be worth considering.
How is a set that has an audio recording and a DVD treated? That may be beyond your scope.
I have not really looked into that. Obviously, you would want to describe both of them. And because I'm not doing RDA in production yet, I'm afraid I don't have any experience, and anything I would tell you would be just off the top of my head, so I'd be afraid to give you the wrong information.
Where can we find the RDA core elements, and is there a separate one for each format?
I don't have RDA open at the moment because I'm giving a presentation. However, there is a list of RDA core elements. I believe it is in Chapter 0, and RDA is not broken down by format in spite of the fact that we've been giving these webinars based on format. The list applies to everything. So there is a published list within RDA, I believe it's in Chapter 0, and it's also marked, each core element should be marked with the instruction in the RDA toolkit right under the number, and it will tell you that it's core. And if it's what I sometimes call conditional core or core if, it will say that to things like this element is core if blah 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 blah. So if it meets that condition, then it's core. If your situation does not meet that condition, then it's not core.
And I believe they're also listed on LC's RDA test website.
It seems possible. LC has created their own additions to core elements. That's part of what is contained in the LCPS.
Okay. What other approaches for indicating durations for multiple works on a CB may be used under RDA, for example, the 306 field?
Certainly, there would be no harm in using a 306 field as coded data. I tend to always want an iReadable equivalent to my coded data. I would have to go back and look at the examples in RDA about the contents notes and whether it is also appropriate or not to incorporate duration in the contents notes the way that we do under AACR2. There's not a lot of guidance about contents notes in RDA, so that may not be terribly clear, even if we go to the right place in RDA.
Someone had asked about the 380 field. You did talk about it again in the context of the authority record, so I'm not sure what else the attendee wanted to know, but can you talk a little bit about the vocabulary for that, and is it used all the time, or is it an optional field?
It's, again, because I'm not using RDA in production, I don't have these things instantly in my memory. I rely on the toolkit a great deal to check these things out. It is available. It is in Chapter 6 as part of naming works and expressions. It, as far as I can recall, does not have a standard list of vocabulary. And because of how MARB approved the proposal and it moved through the process, it is valid in both bibliographic records and authority records in the MARC formats, although it is an element that's at the work level.
Okay, the questioner just wrote in a clarification about asking about 380 in the first bib record you showed. Was there something different about that one?
I don't think so. What I would hope is we move toward more Ferberized records, that you would only have the 380 would be in a work record and it would be inherited by the expression and manifestation information, so that in an ideal world I would put alternative country music in my 380 at the work record and it would not have to appear in a manifestation record. That would be inherited down and put together in pieces and display out to the public with all the information they need.
Okay. One of our attendees has answered one of the questions about the core elements. It says the RDA toolkit has an element set view which lists core elements. It's found under tools.
Thank you for that. And I would say the other thing you can do when you're looking at the toolkit proper is you can filter your view to only display core elements, and you can pull that down off of one of the labels on the upper right-hand side of the toolkit. I can't remember exactly what it's called because, again, I don't have the toolkit open at the moment, but you can get a filtered view of just the core elements. But those would be those identified in RDA proper and not those additional ones identified by the Library of Congress.
For the symphony disc set, how does only noting the sequence, numbers 1 to 4, provide access at the works level for each symphony?
That's a really good question. It continues existing practice from AACR2, and therefore that's part of the interest is in fact carrying forward the access points to be similar to the extent that we can. And there is a specific instruction in RDA Chapter 6 that talks about inclusive numbering. So it's in RDA. I followed it. It follows previous practice, but I agree that it's not obvious to an end user who's looking for, say, Symphony number 3, that they're going to get to it from this particular access point.
Is the relator code still valid in RDA?
The code, I believe so. The preference is for the terms. And I think the preference really is for the terms in Appendix I rather than the terms from the MARC list, but both are available. And as long as the MARC list is available of terms, then the MARC codes should also be available.
What is the timeline to update authority records to reflect RDA added 3XX fields?
This is something that the Program for Cooperative Cataloging is looking at right now. There was an RDA decisions needed task force that took a large number of prioritized, well, identified issues and prioritized them with the goal of having all of the issues addressed, or at least as many as possible, prior to U.S. implementation of RDA. And this is one of those things that I know is on the radar for that group. So there will be guidelines about when to add these 3XX fields, and there will be some discussions about, especially with OCLC, about how to automatically populate some of the things that could be populated, say such as personal birth and death dates taken from the heading and encoded in the 046 dates for the personal names. So that all is supposed to be in place before January 2013.
Well, we have in fact answered all the questions that were submitted, and right on time, so I'll take the presentation rights back so I can just wrap up this wonderful webinar. If you'll wait just a minute, everyone. Okay, thank you, Kathy. That was excellent again for helping us understand the differences between AACR2 and RDA for sound recordings. We have one more webinar on the fall schedule in the RDA series, and do watch for another lineup of RDA webinars coming in the spring. Be sure to check out the ALCTS website for registration information, upcoming webinars, and other ALCTS continuing education events. Attendees will receive an online evaluation form from ALCTS. Please respond as we value your input. We welcome your suggestions for new webinars. You'll find a form for submitting proposals on the website. Before we sign off, I would like to thank Felicity Dicus for providing technical support for today's webinar, and we appreciate your attendance today, and we look forward to sharing other topics with you in the future. Have a good day.